I'd like to begin with asking a question about the general background of the concept of the depression. At the beginning of the book, you say the depression as a clinical category is not relevant for Lacanian psychoanalysts. And the first question is, why is not relevant and important concept, depression, for Lacanian psychoanalysts?
I'll say a few things and then pass on to you, Stijn. I think the position would be that the concept of depression is not irrelevant. One cannot escape this notion of depression in the world of mental health today. It's everywhere. I think the Lacanian standpoint would be to say that it doesn't give us an awful lot of information to say that someone's depressed. It gives us some information, but you could say that depression is a kind of vaguely descriptive term, whereas for purposes of making a diagnosis and thinking about a treatment, a Lacanian orientation is much more interested in saying something structural. And just if we think about it fairly in straightforward terms, we see that's the case, because you can be psychotically structured and you can have some depression. You can be neurotically structured and you can have some depression. So we would want to say we need a little bit more information. We would need to get a structural sense of how a case is being presented. We would want to think about then how these, apparent qualities of depression are featuring within the context of a structure. And we might also want to say something like, well, what are the key conflicts, particularly if we're talking about neurosis, what are the key conflicts underlying this ostensibly depressive state? So the point, I think, would be to say we need more information in terms of structure rather than a descriptive note about that there seems to be some depressed affect there. There's further points to be made, and I'm sure Stijn will make them. One of which is to say that when we're thinking about affects, from a Lacanian standpoint, once again, we want something more structurally rigorous than simply a description of affects. But let me pass on to Stijn. I'm sure he'll have more to say about that.
Yeah, well, I'll just pick into that. I would say that depression is a descriptive term. It's a descriptive term from psychiatry. And like many of the descriptive terms of psychiatry, they don't give us particularly an orientation as to what the subjective dynamic is beyond that description. So, of course, the depressive complaints do exist. And even more so today, of course, when compared to Lacan's days, because we saw that in recent decades, the number of people diagnosed with depressive states that just increased. So it does exist, but there is such a variety within that group that it is very difficult to pick onto that idea of depression and to make like broad generalizations about all depressed patients. And I think especially also while Lacan didn't go on to that track, Freud maybe did go a little bit in that direction when he theorized mourning and melancholia. But I think that the book starts from the observation that it does exist, but on the other hand, there is this complexity and this question of how to think of the clinic of depression. And so it's a bit the encounter between both tendencies, like the conceptualization and description, how to bring that together from our perspective.
I try to understand why Lacan mentions some text outside of the psychiatric and psychoanalytical thinking to describe the depression. Why he refers himself to the Spinoza, for example, Dante, and Saint Aquinas, not Freud or some other post-Freudian psychoanalysts. What is the main point of the depression as a moral failing What do you think?
Well, I think that if there is some generalization to be made about depression from a Lacanian perspective, it will be that perspective that you articulate, like indeed that Lacan said it is a failure, a moral failure. It's something of a sin. But of course, the question is, when there is a sin against what? And here Lacan will say that it's a failing in relation to the ethics of the well-spoken. So and that again is it's quite abstract. But the thing is that Lacan, through his exploration of what ethics is, Lacan will not take like a moral stance. He will not say like at the level of the content what is good and what is bad. Lacan will limit the question of the ethics to something of the procedure. And what is the procedure that is so characteristic for the human being? It is speech. It's the fact that we are, as human beings, as subjects, we are actually a signifying chain. We are a chain, a network of words that circulates in our consciousness. And what is in Lacan's view so typical of depression is that it's an attempt to remain silent about something. It's an attempt to remain silent and to forget and to deny some aspects of your subjective experience by neglecting it, and by sometimes literally not discussing these, not going into the conflict with the people in relation to whom these ideas have been triggered. And I think that's Lacan's key idea, that when we encounter depression, it probably means that someone didn't go the track of really articulating what has been troubling them. And so it's a sin against the ethics of the well-spoken. So speaking about what is living in you. And so you could say more generally also, it's a sin in relation to the idea of desire. Because what is desire in Lacan? Desire is not something fixed. Lacan will not link to you have desire A, you have desire B, you have desire C in terms of specific contents. But in Lacan, desire is like a dynamic principle. Desire is what underlies our actions. It's not specific, like that we can define what our specific object of desire is. No, that he will say it's object A. It's something that is not really tangible, but at the same time that is driving the human being. So the clue is like something of the fluidity of the signifying chain, something of the fluidity of thought. And then depression in Lacan's view, or in a view of Lacanian psychoanalysis, is something of a halt in that process of fluidity. And then, clinically speaking, the question becomes, what has been blocking a person? And so what will be the treatment of depression? Well, more generally, it will be like helping people to find words again, or to find, again, some trust in speaking, some trust again in relating, and in saying what is on your mind, instead of the process of withdrawing or no longer believing in the value of speech, maybe because of some disappointments. And so in that respect, that's for me the general principle, both conceptually, but also clinically, in the sense that clinically, the thing we will do as an analyst is like stimulate good speech. And what is good speech? It's like the speech act itself, and the liberty of free speech is what we will try to establish in clinical settings.
You know, in the so many Lacanian texts, they are discussing, we are discussing the effect of the neoliberalism, for example, effect of the capitalist discourse on the subjects and losing their social bonds with other people. Do you think, Derek, do you think the situation has changed the era we are living in right now? It is radically different from Lacan's era, for example, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Do you think people are different to more eagerly to talk about themselves, their symptoms, their unconscious, etc.? What is their desire? Do you think the people, the subjects, contemporary subjects, are radically different in the background of the last 40 years in the neoliberalism, or such a sociological explanation?
I don't know if people are different, but I think the cultural resources that we have available through which to speak about and understand psychical suffering are somewhat different. So, I mean, just going back to your very first question, one of the reasons that there's some Lacanians who are very critical of the notion of depression is you could say that the concept of depression as an urgent area of medical, whatever, of psychical health is also there in part because there's pharmaceutical companies that will promise us that this is some medication that will eliminate depression.
Mm-hmm.
So if the concept of depression has gained the status and the currency and the importance it has, in part, not totally, but in part because pharmaceutical companies can prescribe some kind of medicine for it, that is something that we should question. So that I think is something which is potentially different historically, but it also gives us some insight into the second question about this, scandalous remark that depression is a moral failing. It's tempting to take that part of Lacan and say, oh, well, this is a bit awkward. How can he say this thing? And say, well, he's a man of his times. But actually, that comment has even more pertinence, you could argue, because increasingly, I think there is a sense in which, particularly in the United States, I think, but maybe it's increasingly a worldwide thing, that you're expected to have some, if you've got some mental suffering, you will have a prescription. You need to take this medicine. And maybe that's the first and most direct response to suffering, not speech. And just to circle back again to the question of depression as a kind of moral failing. In the book, we cite Colette Soler, and she says some interesting things about that. But one way that she reads Lacan's statement is to say, and it's interesting that he's citing theological sources, centuries old sources, rather than contemporary of his time social science. In other words, to go back to what Stijn is saying, it sounds like he's trying to highlight the ethical dilemma and ethics in a precise Lacanian sense, which means that I think what he's calling for as a response to the apparent moral failing, the sin of depression, is speech, which Stijn has already mentioned, but speech to another or a big other in the Lacanian sense, which also implies a subject supposed to know, which implies a process of exploration through speech. So all of those things are important in doing, and the unconscious. So speech, uttered, spoken, used in an exploratory way in a transference dimension to another with reference to an unconscious. Those are dimensions that I think Lacan is tacitly and maybe somewhat provocatively referring to in that statement. And those are 3 or 4 dimensions of a clinical psychoanalytic treatment, which are increasingly on the back foot, which are increasingly bypassed when we think that depression is an ailment for which one gets a prescription, and that's how we deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
And here we could maybe say that the cultural dynamic that has being developed around depression is actually creating the depression from a Lacanian perspective, because in our dominant societal discourse, the solution for depression is something of an engineered solution. It's something that will be given to people, like indeed like a pharmaceutical product or something of another material product, or people have to follow a protocol. But it is something that needs to be completed by them. And so they are in something of a passive position. And it will happen to them by adhering to the therapeutical program, or adhering to taking the medication, or adhering to specific life schemes. That will be the solution. And capitalism is like a very smart system that makes people believe that engineered solutions are our way to happiness. Like also like the products around us, we believe that these will make us happy. And then you could say that Lacan's statement that it is a moral sin is so completely different. It really goes away from the idea that the solution is outside. It's not outside at all. It really starts from recognizing your own inner division. And your own inner division is the fact that in what you think and what you say, that there is something of a fundamental incoherence there, and recognizing that and admitting that it is there, and recognizing it in relation to someone else, like the figure of an analyst, is indeed the kind of solution that we foresee. But it's completely opposed to what capitalism sees as a solution. And from Lacanian perspective, the capitalist solution is actually the thing that the depressed person is locked in. So we kind of propose like a radical move away from that idea that the engineered solution will bring relief for subjective suffering.
That's very important, because part of what strikes one as so problematic about that statement, depression is a moral failing, is that it puts an onus on the sufferer. So that sounds bad, but in a way, as Stijn has just very articulately said, what that's also suggesting is that to be locked into a passive position of a recipient of meds, for example, is perhaps not the best way to respond. Right. It means that the subject should assume a degree of agency and activity in responding, rather than to be locked into this passive recipient role.
I think we come across to an important point right now after your speech. The problem for the subject is also related to restoring a relationship with the other, believing in the other or believing with the other, the concerns of the subject, depression, such as the solution can find in the other and with the other. But also we have a problem with this specific point you mentioned in your text. I reformulate in your statements again. What is the clinical stance in the preliminary interview period as a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, to connect subject to his or her unconscious and the other?
Yeah, well, I think the first difficulty we encounter is that in depression, we usually see like something of a fixation on the ego, which means from Lacanian perspective, on the imaginary dimension of self-experience. And then we will often see that people with depression, but often people today, they focus on their own happiness. They want to be happy if they're unhappy, and they kind of imagine what should change to be happy. Maybe something should change in how you look or what you have, materially speaking. So you have this anticipation of a certain image, of a little scenario, often like a little narrative, a little idea about what do I need, like the right partner, the right house, the right car, the right diploma, and then I will be happy. And they have a little anticipation, but actually they are locked in the imaginary, because it's just like fantasies that are being produced. And contemporary society stimulates this. For example, through the social media, where with TikTok and Instagram, we continuously see images about other people, and that stimulates ourselves to also think about ourselves in terms of these images. But on the other hand, what we also see in depression is that it can go the other way. Like there can develop like a fixation on the negative image, the fixation on the horror image of themselves. Like I'm a failure, will then be the idea, and also I'm ugly, I'm bad. And then again, you have a fixation on an idea, on an image, and that will also, both tendencies, these imaginary tendencies, will actually be linked to not speaking and to not like openly addressing something in relation to the other, because these imaginary preconceptions already block something in the interaction, because people then maybe think it's because I'm so stupid and so ugly that I'm not worth of like being open, because when I'm open, maybe the other will judge me, they will see my failure, and so therefore I will not speak about it. And here we, as analysts, have like real work to do, like creating something of a switch, that it's not about cultivating an ideal image and not about being ashamed because of what you only are. And our speech, what we want, is something else. And that also for the depressed person is something that comes as a surprise, because often when they arrive, they want to complain. And they want to complain about their symptoms, about them not being motivated, their problems with eating and with sleeping, and it's very repetitive. But from Lacanian perspective, it's very empty. Even if they speak, it's empty speech, because it's not revealing something about their very specific situation, like them in relation to others in their lives, them in relation to their own past. And that will be the real trick or the real challenge in analysis, to switch to something of this very subjective speech, because this is also what happens in psychoanalysis. For example, we prefer that someone talks about a dream rather than someone talks about how ugly they are, because the dream is something of the surprise. The dream is something of what was not anticipated, but that is still part of me. So it's something about the subjective division, and it's making people sensitive to this other kind of discourse. That's the thing that, as analysts, we have to try to install, but in a very gentle way, because people with depression tend to be overwhelmed or shocked, or find it a bit brutal if we go like more explicitly against their imaginary tendencies. And so it's something of a symbolic operation that needs to be done, but in such a way that it's not like too brutal for them, but at the same way, in the same way, well, it should be pretty clear that we are listening to something else than just a complaint. We are listening to something of, indeed, of desire and of the very specificity of a person's life.
If I'm wrong, please correct me. You didn't mention imaginary dimension in the depression in the book. Am I right?
Well, I think it is there, but it's not something, indeed, that through the different chapters that has been stressed so strongly. And maybe and probably it is connected to the fact that in Lacan's theorization, Lacan rather focuses on the question of the symbolic in depression. And the idea is then, of course, what is depressed is not so much the subject, it is the other that is depressed from Lacanian perspective, meaning like the other of speech and of articulation. That's the thing that is in something of a down position, and it's like revaluing the symbolic is the clue. But of course, what is the counterpart of a symbolic system that is not really active in the articulation of difference? It is an imaginary that comes to the fore. But I was just thinking it because we were discussing like the capitalist system, because capitalism really thrives on the imaginary. It is a culture that presents us over and over again with fragmentary images of happiness and unhappiness. And then we see that our patients move along these images. They're fixated onto what they are not, like images of happiness, but also they are attracted to images of unhappiness, which we specifically, for example, see that some people are drawn on the internet to images of destruction, for example, images of self-harm, where something of the failure is being presented, but not in terms of speech, but rather as images, fixed images. And there you could say that these fixed images of suffering are actually the illustrations of the moral failing of good speech.
Okay, before I jump to the melancholia, I want to emphasize something about Lacan's insistence, marvelous, striking position as a clinician. You know, in the book, you said you talked about three patients of Lacan, Gérard Haddad, Catherine Milot, and Jean Gulaveux. Lacan visited Jean-Claude Lavreux in the hospital 20 times, right? 20 times. He wanted to show something to his patients passionately or ethically, maybe ethically we can say this word. What do you think about Lacan's position as a clinician? This insistence, this maybe passion, maybe ethical stance, or just desire of the analyst?
Well, I think that example of indeed Jean-Claude Lavreux, who was a psychiatrist himself, hospitalized with depression, and Lacan indeed visited him in the hospital 20 times. That's what Lavreux himself wrote about Lacan. On the one hand, I think it clearly expresses indeed the idea of the desire of the analyst. So it articulates something of, I'm there. There is a presence. And so you could say, and what is it that is present? It's something of a listening. It's something of an availability for the other. And here, of course, important to say is that when the analyst tries to be available for a patient, this should be clear. Like visiting a patient in hospital, that's very far away from the idea of what an analyst does or did in these days. It's very far removed from an analyst, like an IPA analyst, with the image of the one who just remains silent behind the couch and is just there. Well, here it's something active, but at the same time, it's an attempt both to be active, but without imposing yourself, without imposing your ego, or without imposing like a specific program of what the other must do. It's rather presenting the possibility of an encounter, a being there for what? Not for the body of the other, but a being there for when some symbolic element pops up, and then to hear it, and so it's a being there with a listening attitude. And when there is little symbolic materials that point to something very specific, that is not like generalizable across patients, but very specific for that one patient, when we hear that, picking onto that. And that's what the other examples also show, like the example of Catherine Milot. She bears witness to how Lacan heard specific signifiers and picked onto these and made surprising interventions. And that had like a revitalizing effect on her, maybe because she really felt hurt by someone who was not like listening in a very generalizing way, like the one who was seeing 20 patients and listening to all of them in the same way, but rather like being listened to and in a very unique, in her uniqueness. And that's, I guess, the trick also of breaking that anonymous experience of depression, because it's also very, although you are depressed, it's very anonymous because the group resembles one another, and it's like being listened to in your singularity, in your uniqueness of your specific use of words. That's the point. And I think linking an intervention to very specific articulation of words, that's the point, the clinical operation to try to do in the cases of depression.
Okay, the singularity, I think is the nodal point of your book. I don't know, do you agree with me or not? Because you too, as a clinician, you emphasized whether neurotic or psychotic, some point about singularity of the subject. Solution that Lacanian psychoanalysis can offer our patients, our subjects' patients, has to have a relationship with singularity. What do you think? Not some norms, normality, adaptation, etc.
Yeah. Well, here I would say that there is many meanings that we can attribute to the idea of what singularity precisely is. But I think in this context, we can say that we can if maybe depression is something of a general category, and then we assume, if we speak about depression, that there is something generalizable across cases. Singularity, of course, is this very point where something is not generalizable. And the clue of working with depression is, of course, finding that specific point. Like in hearing it, we break the principle of the sinning against the idea of the ethics of the good speech. It's because paying attention to the very specific details of someone's speech is precisely doing good speech. And there we have to make that distinction that Derek was also pointing to, this distinction between neurotic and psychotic functioning, because singularity will be something else. And what we can say in general about singularity in neurosis is that it will be related to specific use of the signifier. And what is the signifier in neurosis? It's a signifying chain, and there is something of the always surprising signifying element. And so paying attention to singularity in neurosis is paying attention to the surprising signifier. Whilst in psychosis, the dynamic is different, because their singularity will have to be with the breaking up of the signifier, of the signifying chain, with an impossibility to still articulate something. And what then comes to the fore is something of what we call jouissance, meaning like an overwhelming, maddening force against which words are no longer a defense. And this is also very singular, because it will differ across patients with psychosis, like also across patients with melancholia. It will differ, but their melancholic experience will be related to very specific sensitive aspects in their functioning, where something of the signifier is not organizing their experiences. And discovering or finding what these specific points are, where the vulnerabilities are of a patient, that's very important, because then we can start thinking about how to circle around these and how to help people to not brutally be confronted with these, but to kind of circumvent these and go around these. And then the transference serves that purpose of through conversations with the patients, still being in touch with them, and not like disappearing in those specific points. Well, pointing again to that idea of the limiting functioning of the limiting function of the symbolic, here I think we can situate Lacan's classic idea of the name of the father as that which characterizes differentiation between neurosis and psychosis. Because what is neurosis? It is adhering to some of the limits that are there. It's believing in the limits. It's attuning your own life in terms of the limits that are being imposed onto you, and you take them with you. And what is characteristic of psychosis, Lacan would say it's the foreclosure, it's the not functioning of the name of the father. But if the name of the father is the law, it is the limit. It is the impossibility. It's the impossibility of doing something and realizing a very specific thing. And then here indeed we see that this is very specific to melancholia compared to neurotic depression, that it is an impossibility to stop. It's an impossibility to stop thinking, for example, about the fact that life has no meaning. Whilst the neurotic is maybe someone who thinks about it, but who also tries to escape it, and who does manage in some way or another to be in a conflict at that level. Whilst in melancholia, it's an impossibility to escape the very thought itself. And therefore, they come to a kind of a rational conclusion that indeed life has no sense, and they don't have a possibility to escape that thought. And so it's something of the limit that is not functioning. And the limit here indeed is like that which is functioning in the context of neurosis and kind of absent at specific points in the context of psychosis, and therefore in the context of melancholia. But again, linking to your initial question, where you started from the distinction between the singular and the particular, and Derek went on the track of the particular, I want to say something about the universal as well, because here maybe it's important to stress that what the universal for Lacan is, for example, the idea that there is no sexual rapport, that there is no sexual relation. And this is something that is true for every human being. We don't have a spontaneous relation to the fact of our own drives. The drive is living in the body. We are sexuated beings and we don't know how to deal with it. And the same is true for our relation to the other. We don't have an automatic relation to the other. And that's a universal problem that any human being is confronted with. And then, of course, we can see that often in cases of, for example, melancholia, people are hyper aware of that, hyper aware of the non-rapport, of the fact that there is no inherent meaning, that there is no inherent organization to aspects of human life. And they cannot escape the very thought of the process of thinking about that very point. So for me, that's an expression of something of the universal, because actually that's one of the problematics that any human being is struggling with, and our lives are something of a defense against that very point, that very conclusion, that the real aspect of human being.
I'd like to ask you the position of the psychotherapist, psychoanalyst is working with a melancholic patient. What kind of other or big other the psychoanalyst has to embody it in the psychoanalytical work with the melancholic patient? It's an enigmatic clinician, or just secretary of the psychotic, or some individualized, singular position, every case by case. What did you say? What do you say?
Yeah, well, here I would say, and that's something that I discuss both in one of the chapters where I discuss the treatment of melancholia, and in the chapter that I wrote together with Joachim Kouwe, my colleague. There we clearly indicate in both chapters that we have to be a castrated other as an analyst in the treatment, meaning like someone who is not complete, who is not enjoying, who is lacking something, and it's something of that lack that should be clear, so that we are not in charge of everything, not in charge of everything that is going on. So it's starting from a position of being limited that we start interacting with the other. And then I think we should try to be something of a conversation partner. And a conversation partner is someone who actually implicitly expresses a belief in speech, a belief in the fact that articulating ideas and about what you might do in life does make sense. That's doing conversation. It's embodying that possibility of going on, because characteristic of melancholia is, of course, that there is always the tendency that they will conclude that it doesn't make sense to continue to go on with life, and then there is this possibility of suicide, of passage à l'acte. So we should be the ones who always and again are willing to go on, and therefore we have to start from a certain naivety. We have to be naive in a certain sense. And if the melancholic is already convinced that there is no sense, that the real is overwhelming, we should be the ones who try to nevertheless incarnate the possibility of continuing speaking and thinking and acting. And without knowing what to do, we should be the ones who embody the possibility of doing and speaking as such, and that maybe doing and speaking as such is enough to continue living. Because I think that's also the very point that actually your own analysis as a Lacanian analyst leads to, it brings you to the point of there is actually nothing that guarantees my existence. There is actually nothing that guarantees the meaningfulness of what I'm doing. But at the same time, I am something of a process. I am this process of the unconscious because the signifier is living in me. And I'm the one who is witnessing the occurrence of the signifier in me. And that's a process to which I'm attending. And well, like implementing something of that in therapy, like, of course, I do not know the meaning of life and I cannot explain it to my melancholic patients, but at the same time, I can try to be there and listen to my melancholic patients the same way as I can listen to my own, to this, to how the signifier lives in me, because I also don't know the clue of what is going on in myself. Well, and being relaxed with that very like bit of a pessimistic point, but at the same time, it's a very vital point. And trying to be there in relation to your patient with that attitude is what I think makes a difference.